All right, everybody out there in the tubes of the internet, welcome to part two of This Week in Space for the week of, what month is it? April the 6th, 2026 to April the 12th of 2026. And today we're covering Mars's conjunction with Neptune. I had a flight to catch yesterday, so I wasn't able to finish my report. Also, I had a lot of stuff to talk about in this last section. So, yeah, I broke it up into two parts. And today we will be talking about the Mars Neptune conjunction through the lens of Herman Melville's literary classic, Moby Dick. Good morning, Gina Maria. Good morning, everybody out there. Before I get into the Mars Neptune conjunction, just want to remind folks that I'm going to be co-facilitating an Oracle Dream Retreat in Greece. And that will be May 8th through 15th. I think that there's one or two spaces still available. So if you are interested, you can reach out to my the person who's putting the retreat together, Sarah Janes. You can find her on Instagram at Sarah Janes Dreaming, or you can go to the website themysteries.org, and this is the Dream Oracle Retreat. And during this retreat, we are going to be exploring the precognitive powers of dreams, and we'll be going to Delphi, Epidavros, and a couple other ancient sacred dreaming sites. And it's going to be pretty amazing. So I hope to see you all there. Also, there is a new episode of the Melee Report that just dropped. It's a little different than the usual astro weather of the week. Excuse me. This one is a overview of the planets going from the moon up through the sun in a fun-filled and jam-packed playlist. And you can find that on my SoundCloud at Camp Wizard Camp, or there is a link in my bio, and I'll put a link in the show notes for the folks on YouTube and the podcast. And it also comes out as a Spotify playlist if you don't want to hear my brilliant insights into the astro weather and why I chose what I chose. So anyway, I'll throw all of that in the show notes for folks out there. All right. So again, welcome to This Week in Space for April the 6th, 2026 through April the 12th, 2026. This is part two of your weekly wizard report. We're going to be covering the Mars Neptune conjunction. So away we go. On Sunday, April the 12th, we will have Mars in Aries conjunct Neptune in Aries, and this is occurring at 2 degrees and 39 arc minutes of that cardinal fire sign. So let me pull this up on the chart for for the folks on the YouTube, if I can remember how to do that. Give me one second. All right, so there we go. We have move that out of the way. We have Mars right here in the sign that they rule, Aries, their diurnal home at 2 degrees and 39 arc minutes. And then we have Neptune right there, 2 degrees, 39 arc minutes. Saturn right there at 7 degrees and 3 arc minutes of Aries. So Mars kind of sandwiched in between the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Mars will go on to conjunct Saturn the following Sunday. So, all right. So in This Week in Space, part one, we talked a lot about the relationship of Mars and Neptune, with Mars moving into the sign of Aries and activating that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And now I want to look at this relationship of Mars and Neptune from a kind of same, but different perspective, as they perfect their conjunction on Sunday, April the 12th. And I personally have Mars square Neptune in my natal chart. And so this is a energy or an archetype that I am living with, and I've kind of done a lot of thinking around. And one of the ways that I've thought about this relationship between Mars and Neptune, personally, is through the lens of Herman Melville's literary classic, Moby Dick, which is maybe my favorite book of all time. And at its core, uh, it's a story of a whaling captain named Ahab who becomes obsessed with the white whale, Moby Dick, who is Ahab's nemesis. And Moby Dick ate one of Captain Ahab's legs in a previous encounter, and now Ahab will stop at nothing to get his revenge on the white whale. And he basically hijacks his entire crew of the Pequot, his ship, and holds them hostage in pursuit of his quest for revenge. And the crew has all signed up onto this whaling ship to do a job and to make some money. And Ahab's monomaniacal thirst for revenge supersedes everyone else's goals and intentions for this voyage. In his obsession, Captain Ahab doesn't care who is hurt or what gets destroyed as long as he can kill and conquer the white whale. And so, Jungian analyst Edward Edinger, who I reference a lot on this show, wrote a book called Melville's Moby Dick, An American Nekyia. And Nekyia is like a underworld journey or a night sea voyage. I actually don't have a physical copy yet to show y'all. I just have a printout, which is all dog-eared and underlined. And as I was reviewing my printouts, I decided to buy an actual physical copy, which I can hold up at a later date. But um, anyway, Edward Edinger writes that Ahab is a study in the psychology of resentment. His image serves as a mirror, showing the true nature of our own resentments. Everyone has this problem. A monomaniacal Ahab whose means are sane, but whose motives and object are mad. Resentments that strives to get even, that inflicts one hurt for another, that asserts one's personal power over anything that challenges it, or that withdraws in sudden wounded majesty, disdaining to communicate with a world that doesn't recognize its sovereignty. These are the expressions of Ahab in every soul. And I find this interesting. Many of you may or may not know this, that I'm in recovery and I actually just celebrated 12 years of sobriety on Easter, on the 5th. And in AA, they do a lot of work around resentments, and they talk about how resentments are something that can cause somebody to relapse or to drink again, and that really take people out of the game. One of the ways that I've heard resentments talked about is like drinking poison and hoping somebody else will die. Um, and, I think that resentment as a core motivation, either for Ahab or for people's actions, the desire to get even, and inflict one hurt for another, as Edinger says, or to like withdraw in sullen, wounded majesty. I think that this is kind of a component that we all live with and all must deal with, and it doesn't really serve us in the long run. And so, I think as we're talking about Mars conjunct Neptune, it is an opportunity to examine some of our resentments and to think about ways that we can process some of these feelings, the desire for revenge, the desire to get even, or the kind of withdrawing and sulking. And I see the desire for revenge as a very martial characteristic, and then the wounded kind of I'm a victim here is a very Neptunian theme. Anywho, Edinger goes on to say, this resentment at our loss of original unconscious wholeness is a resentment against the specifically human task of developing consciousness, a sacrificial task requiring the acceptance of dismemberment as part of the process. And for me, I think my alcoholism and rampant drug abuse was very much tied up in this Neptune Mars square, the sort of longing for wholeness and the feeling of separation and the feeling of resentment and victimhood at that separation and the need to sort of lash out or at myself or at the world for that perceived separation. And a lot of my recovery is trying to come into that, what Edinger calls the original unconscious wholeness. And, this is a constant process. I don't think we ever arrive at this, but, it is something that is interesting to set our sights on. And I think that Moby Dick, in a lot of ways in this book, represents that ideal wholeness that we are always sort of chasing after. And I think that there are skillful ways and unskillful ways of doing that. And, what Edinger talks about is part of that process is the dismemberment of the ego, of our identity. And, I think we all go through this in various ways. And in alcoholism, addiction, and recovery, that is part of the process where everything breaks apart and we need to pick up the pieces and sort of put them back together and reorient ourselves to, what the goal is and what we're trying to achieve. And Moby Dick, the white whale, represents this sort of numinous, the state of nature in the natural world. I mean, it represents a ton of things from, the American dream. It's been written about as manifest destiny. It has been written about as the desire for union with the divine. It is there's hundreds of different writings on the meaning of Moby Dick, which we don't have time to cover in this short section of the report. But it is also an archetype or pure form of the whale. The whale as, this kind of idealized image. And it is a representation of the wild primal power of nature. On a psychological level, the white whale may represent the energy of the unconscious, which both drives and inspires us. And Ahab seeks to overcome and conquer these primal forces. In terms of the current astrology, we can see Moby Dick as the Neptunian state of undifferentiated oneness, of whole consciousness, a state of oneness and unity with nature, which is at odds with the egotistical will to dominate, which is representational of Mars in this conjunction, in which Ahab embodies in this story. According to Edinger, Moby Dick can be seen as the Jungian idea of the self, which can be understood as the integrated wholeness. And I'll talk about that a little later, which Ahab is seeking to run down, overtake, and to overcome through force of will. However, this is not a process that can be achieved through martial force or egoistic will. Ahab represents the will and the violence of Mars locked in the ego identity, which chases after the elusive Neptunian vision, the white whale, that is far bigger and more powerful than any individual ego. Edinger continues saying, Ahab demonstrates the fact that resentment is an inflation, an identification with the ego, with the self. Sorry, an identification of the ego with the self. It is its eventual consequence is a fall, a catastrophe. But prior to that, there may be evidence of an extraordinary energy, a demonic drive that taps non-personal psychic energy for narrow personal ends. And this is the case with Ahab. He becomes possessed and loses his shit, seeking only to catch and conquer the whale. And he is willing to forsake or destroy anything and everything in his path in order to achieve this goal. And Edinger writes about Ahab's hunt for the white whale, saying, "We all contain within us raw, undifferentiated, natural life energies. If we are to have a conscious psychic life, it must feed on and transform these elemental energies. The archetypal energy forms of the collective unconscious must be dismembered and broken down into assimilable units, like Osiris and like the captured whale, if the primordial energies are to be made available for conscious purposes. However, these are superpersonal energies, most aptly described as deities. Hence, they must be approached with a religious attitude. Failure to do so is an act of hubris, which does not recognize the existence of any power other than the will of the ego. In such cases, the ego does not succeed in assimilating the energies of the archetypal form. Rather, the archetype assimilates the ego. This is a disaster for the conscious personality. It undergoes a regression and lives out unconsciously the fate of the particular mythological image with which it is identified. And so it was with Ahab. And so it is with people like Pete Hegseth, who I spoke about yesterday, Netanyahu, Trump, and all of the monomaniacal and warmongering world leaders who have hijacked our collective ship in search of the destruction of something illusory and intangible. One of the things about Neptune is they can have a kind of mono focus. One can become obsessed with what they seek, kind of like the Cyclops in the Odyssey. They can become, obsessed with whatever belief overtakes oneself. And so, with Mars involved with Neptune here, the individual can become driven by the Neptunian fantasy so that one can only focus on the belief or the illusion to the exclusion of every other possibility. And so, these leaders have become hijacked by the archetypal and are living out the mythology of Ahab's crusade against the whale, or the mythology of Armageddon or Ragnarok, or whatever other terrible myth that has consumed them and drives them towards death and destruction in pursuit of the white whale. So psychologist James Kirsch sees Ahab as foreshadowing the 20th century dictatorships. And Edinger writes about this, that Ahab gathers all hands on deck to inform them of his vengeful plans to seek out Moby Dick and destroy him. The power of his conviction is contagious, with true rabble-rousing technique evoking hatred, then providing an enemy on which to vent the hatred. Ahab infects the whole crew with his madness. And Edinger continues on by saying, the most ruthless dictators gain their power by making what can only be called, no matter how perverse, a spiritual appeal. They awaken in their followers the diamondism of an archetypal image, an ideal. And once awakened, such an image has tremendous power. It generates the capacity to sacrifice personal and material well-being to a sometimes astonishing degree, for it conveys a sense of nobility, a way of life that transcends the ego and personal desires and creates a devotion to a superpersonal purpose. Such a process is always operating in mass movements. So, in this passage, we have several Neptunian themes. The idea of spiritual appeal, which, when combined with Mars and the archetype of the conflict-oriented sign of Aries, we get the spiritual appeal for collective action and conflict that unites people in mass movements. Also, the theme of sacrifice, which is connected both to Neptune as well as the sign of Aries. Neptune is willing to sacrifice for the ideal or for the greater good, while Aries sacrifices for the heroic. Aries and its ruler Mars is willing to throw itself into the line of fire to be the hero, and willing to perform heroic deeds no matter what the cost, so it can live on in Valhalla, or in the Bard's song, or to have its photo enshrined forever in the trophy case. Neptune also calls us towards the dissolving of individual identity in favor of what Edinger called the devotion to a superpersonal purpose. It is longing to be swept up in the collective wave of the mass movement and to lose oneself in the sea of the collective. which is at odds with Aries' drive for individuality and the martial will. However, violence and war can be framed as collective movements, which both allow the individual to assimilate into the collective whole and to become an individual through heroic deeds. And Dionysus, which is connected to the Neptunian archetype, was both a god of ecstatic experience and a god of war. The relationship between ecstasy and chaotic violence is really personified by this deity. The transcendent quality of combat where individuals lose themselves in the moment and in the chaos of the martial battlefield and also in the movement of the collective, where the relationship to death allows people to feel most alive. And I referenced a Hillman essay on Mars yesterday, which talks about that sort of tension between people feeling most alive when in wartime. And Ernst Junger, who is a German soldier in the First World War, wrote a memoir, really beautiful memoir about battle. And he really grabs onto this idea that people are most alive during wartime. And, I've also heard that the ecstatic as something that I've heard the ecstatic described as something that transcends the sense of individual ego and pulls us into connection with something far greater than ourselves. And this state can be found in a number of ways. However, with the Mars Neptune conjunction on Sunday, in this Mars ruled sign of Aries, the desire for the ecstatic experience will most likely have a martial quality to it and be activated most easily through competition, copulation, conflict, and combat. And this could look like flow state activities, athletic endeavors, sexual interactions, or through ritualized or physical combat. All of these things can pull us out of ourselves, but all actions have consequences, which will most likely be revealed next week when Mars conjoins Saturn and we begin to reap what has been sown in the longing for transcendence that Neptune has called forth. And so Edinger writes that Ahab is able to sway his hearers so easily because he activates a latent archetypal pattern, the conflict of human consciousness against evil and the powers of darkness. When activated, such an image can release tremendous energies. Whether these energies work for good or ill depends on the quality and the extent of the human consciousness that mediates them. History's greatest atrocities have been perpetrated by men in the unconscious grip of this archetype. Ahab, possessed by this mythological motivation and its unconscious powers, magically infects the lesser developed personalities of his crew. And again, this is what we are seeing with autocratic leaders who have infected their sycophantic followers with the myth of good versus evil. This is a myth of otherness, a shadow that is projected outward onto whales, immigrants, Muslims, anything that can serve as the receptacle for our own unmetabolized shadow, which is externalized onto another person, being, nation, or culture, which is then forced to carry the shadow so that we don't have to. This is the ethos of the crusade and holy war, the desire to destroy the darkness that a nation or individual cannot bear to witness or face in themselves. So it is outsourced onto an external entity which becomes framed as evil. Because if we are holy, good, and righteous, then that evil must go somewhere. And if I'm completely good, then the evil must be out there somewhere. And in this binary framework, good and evil are two sides to a coin, and you cannot have one without another. So people seek to destroy the externalized vision of evil, which is projected onto the other, in the hopes that this will rid us of that which we cannot bear to acknowledge within ourselves. When the collective shadow becomes mobilized, it sweeps up entire nations in the myth of good versus evil, us versus them, right versus wrong. This binary is limiting and stifling, It is the ego seeking to find some form of reconciliation with the vastness and complexity of life and the archetypal forces of the unconscious which drive us. This is Ahab's quest to dominate the whale, to control what is ultimately uncontrollable, to bring death to life that exists beyond him, a life which he has no part of because he is trapped in his own revenge fantasies and a flattened notion of a binary world which exists in the polarity of good and evil and the belief that what exists beyond him can be overcome by force. And so Edinger relates Moby Dick to the Jungian notion of the self. He says, the whale can relate to opposites simultaneously and thus transcend and reconcile them. This is one of the features of the self, which distinguishes it most clearly from the lesser center of the personality, the conscious ego. Consciousness, by its very nature, exists by separation of opposites, by acquiring unilateral vision. The self, the superpersonal center of the personality, has a bilateral vision. It incorporates both sides of a pair of opposites in the total view and hence conveys wholeness. I believe this search for wholeness, my friends, is the hunt for the white whale. But we don't achieve wholeness through eliminating the other or by destroying the whale. We can only achieve wholeness through coming to terms with ourselves and accepting and integrating the shadow parts of our own individual consciousness, as well as the collective consciousness. While contrary to the collective movements and Neptunian idealism, this is an individual process that also ripples out into the fabric of the collective. Hopefully, with Mars conjoining Neptune today, it will help us to gather the courage to look within ourselves and come to terms with who we are and work to accept and reconcile the parts of ourselves that are challenging and uncomfortable. So, so we are able to step into who we can be as more integrated and whole beings in order to create a new reality that redirects the current flow of the collective energy away from the worship of death and towards something more generative and life affirming. And so, with that, my friends, that concludes your Week in Space Part 2 for the Neptune Mars conjunction on Sunday. I hope that this was helpful to somebody out there. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. And I will see you next week for what I hope to be more complete one-shot wizard report. But yeah, until then, my friends, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and as always, may the force be with you. All right, bye now.